the slides are. Is this the control? Yes. Alrighty, give me a second to. So I had 1 hour, because it's not the time that was on the schedule. I'll try to make it pretty organized. Well, first, I'm very pleased to be here. You may wonder what I'm doing on the panel. You may not think of an economist as a scientist. I would argue that economics, and particularly my specialty of finance, qualifies as a science, but that's not the topic for today. But in any case, whether you think of that as science or not, economics, and particularly finance, is very influential in all the issues that have been raised. So you heard Ms. Roberts talking about what drives things. And I can say on the issue of the fiction, fake news in particular, just like bad science, are bad. That's an opening, unqualified statement. But why is it bad? I think it's a little bit, what's worse than not knowing? Being ignorant, what's worse? Thinking you know it when you don't. So let me give you a simple example. We're here, and I tell you, you're going to go on a trip. So you better go home and pack. Now, if I told you we're going to Singapore, you'd know how to pack. If I told you we're going to the Arctic Circle, you'd know how to pack. But what would you do if I told you you're going on a trip, but I'm not going to tell you which one you're going to? How would you pack then? It would be different. Why? Because you'd have to be able to get by, survive, whichever of the two actually turned out to be where you ended up. If you thought you knew you were going to Singapore but really didn't know, you would pack for Singapore, but if you ended up in the Arctic, it would be a disaster, and vice versa. That's what I'm trying to point out about the dangers beyond just being ignorant, the dangers of believing you know when you don't. It's similar to saying, if you know you're uninsured, that's bad. But if you think you're insured when you're not, that's really bad, because you won't react to it. So it's important that we examine this, and I'm going to try my hand at sort of observations elaborating on the topics that you heard: climate change, big one, GMOs, and we'll hear more. I want to point out that I'm going to work with examples from economics. I'm not going to try my hand at any of those topics, especially when you have the experts in the room. Why would I? And I picked two areas for my examples, and then I'll tell you what I'm actually going to do. The two areas are financial crisis. The best known latest one was from 2008, 2009, 10, world crisis in financials. I picked that because that's a time of extreme stress in the economic system. And in times of stress, people sometimes, or organizations sometimes do things that are not so great. They're more likely to make mistakes under those conditions. The other I want to use is pensions, retirement part of the life cycle. Now, why do I bring that up here? Well, one of the things that we have had to face since when we came out of the slime in any kind of organization is how do we look after people in our society when they no longer can work but are still living? And we call that retirement. And we've had to address that problem by one way or another since we came out of the slime. We have to address that problem today, and we'll have to address that problem in 200 years. A difference of this, this challenge, and it is a challenge because today every country in the world sees itself, including China, as having a retirement crisis. Not in the instant paying for people's retirement this year, but looking at the system, they can see that it is not adequate. It is not adequate to provide an adequate retirement or a sensible or fair or reasonable retirement for people in the future. And this is true globally. Even in Singapore, which is the most organized place you can find on the planet for a country, where they have a 37% contribution rate out of people's wages. for retirement, they're worried. And here in China. Now, part of that, the reason I bring this up, part of that is people will say, that's because of good demographics. This group of you out there are going to live longer. That's good news. We're happy about that. And yes, if you're going to live longer, we have to figure out how you're going to pay for those extra years when you're not working. Okay? So that's a good thing. That is a challenge. But I will try to show you in the short time I have here that that's not where the crisis has come from. It's part of it. But if that were the only thing, demographic surprise, we wouldn't have the problem that we have today. And so what came out of that was very similar, in my view, to the problem as I see it, say, for the climate. You can't fix climate overnight. You can't wait another 30 or 40 years and say, whoops, temperature's up, turn the thermostat down, at least unless you guys come up with something pretty amazing. It takes time, and so does the retirement system. The big difference here is that no one is claiming that people are not going to have to retire in the future. So we don't have that challenge, but it doesn't seem to affect it. So I want to use these examples, and what I hope to do is to explore a bit more deeply the sort of reasons why we have these, that's if I can get the slide to work. All right. Yeah, there it is. I know I find the button in the right place. So I want to look at, we're talking about the fiction called distortion of science. I want to ask three types of questions about it and look at it in more detail. First is, how are we able to distort science? What are the various processes? I want to break it down because I think if you break it down, then if you look at how it's done in individual situations, you can do a better job of treating it, rather than treat everything as if it's a simple one-line monolith for all of these. Second, I'm going to ask, why do we distort science if we can? And it turns out, if you explore that a little bit, you see it's a lot of different reasons, and it's not one single answer, and therefore one single cure. And finally, I want to ask, what are the unintended social consequences of distortions in science? One of the things that happens with all policies is we have consequences that weren't planned on, weren't intended, and they sometimes can be very substantial. So it's a how, why, and what. Now, before I turn into those, I want to say a few things about the process of someone asked me this morning, what are the financial implications, or what are the impacts of false information, fake news? Now, certainly, if a piece of wrong news comes out, and we don't know it, and marketplaces, I'll use finance markets only because they're a particular strategic research site for information. But what we find is when a piece of information comes out, and it was not expected, markets respond, as do others. Markets are important to look at, one, because they do give us an enormous amount of information, because they have a competitive process which doesn't say everything they react to is correct, but the incentives to act to them correct are very strong, and they're very hard to mitigate. It takes a lot to do it, and they're very quick. Quick doesn't always mean most accurate. So you have a piece of information come out, the markets react. It turns out the information is false, and it's verified or false that it's false. What happens? It reverts back basically nothing. However, if the source of that information continues to produce fake news or wrong information, then the system adjusts and it stops reacting. We see that in my own country. We elected I don't think this is going to be a surprise to any of you. We elected a president last November, and he is probably the most news thing you'll see every day. And he's tweeting and sending out all kinds of things, some of them pretty unusual for a leader. And initially, those had some pretty big impacts. He says, oh my God, and it happened. But if you watch the markets, after a while, they just didn't even react to it. Now, that doesn't mean they don't react to everything that comes out of there, but they don't just react to the action. to the noise. They react to the noise. They react to what the implication of actual actions are. Okay? Now, what's the cost of that kind of thing, other than our time and getting some people a little nervous? The cost of that is that once they stop reacting to that source of news, that channel of information to all of us is closed. It used to be when the White House said something, we all learned something. But if you have what's coming out of the White House being seen by decision makers as not real news, not real facts, not something that's actually going to happen, okay, then they stop reacting to it. And it's like the famous story in every culture and language about the boy who cried wolf. When you really have something to say, people won't believe you. But the real cost to society, in my view, is the fact that you shut down, in this case, a fairly important information channel. And shutting down information channels, particularly in times of stress or major changes, is not good policy. Ignorance is not bliss in that regard. And the notion that somehow if we keep everything, nobody knows anything, we'll all be stable, is the wrong measure. What stays stable is that the information flow is static because nothing of reality is coming out. But that doesn't stop reality from continuing to change. And so it just leaves us blind. So I wanted to say that. And then the last one, and the reason I connect with pensions and the climate, is some things can be verified by experiment or seeing what happens fairly quickly. Therefore, you can see whether it works or not, or you have a good idea if it does. There are other things, I think to some extent, you can get it indirectly for climate change, but we're not actually going to see what happens to the climate 50 years from now for some long time. And the same things to things like pensions. We can analyze where we're going to be, we can say it, but people don't see it as a reality at the moment. It's not immediate. And they're willing to accept that, well, that's a problem, but I've got more pressing problems. They always find reasons to push it to the back. And I think that's part of it with climate versus some of the more immediate ones. Maybe prosaic, but it's a fact. The retirement thing, as we'll see, is a kind of window from the past as to what we might have in the future if we don't do something about it. Because we really have a problem now as a result of the past of the same behavior. The other thing I wanted to say is also that part of my thesis for you is, yes, it's perhaps become more noticeable, you have a sense of a greater attack on science, and certainly in a marginal sense, there's no question that's the case, than in the past. But I think you'll find that, and I'm going to try to give some examples in the next few minutes, that this has been going on for a long time. And we have lots of people that have just paid no attention to scientific results and conclusions, and that it's not in that sense new. It may be more intense due to the internet, to social media, and so forth, where we're bombarded with lots of information. I think that, I mentioned again in the question this morning's session, I think that part of what we're seeing is like a teenager when it grows up. But you're a teenager, it's not quite an adult. You're not quite an adult. Some of you will remember that. And yet you're kind of getting there. Sometimes I think China is a little like that as a country. All the parts of you didn't grow exactly at the same proportion. So you're a little out of whack. And I kind of view that all of this information explosion, which I think on the whole is very good, that all of us have access to incredible amounts of information, and much more as time goes on, search engines and so forth. One can get now, my late father was a famous academic. He spent years studying 17th century England, collecting information on 3x5 cards, and wrote important work on that. Probably that same information you could get on something like Google in an afternoon now. And he spent years putting it together. That's great. But like many things that are functional, always remember this. The most functional things will have some dysfunctional aspect. There's virtually nothing I can think of that is pure good or even pure bad. So even the most dysfunctional has some functional elements. One of the dysfunctions here is we get all this information fast, quickly, and to us. We can be wired up, I am, you are, all of you. Except, we have to decide from all this information, which of the information should you rely on? How do you decide? You know, in publishing, in academia, we have peer reviews and so forth. This is one kind of screening. I like not to think censoring, okay? But some people might consider that, you know, people who run journals have a particular point of view. But it's a screening process. So when you read the journal, you know it's gone through a review process, and if it's established a good reputation and is trusted, then you tend to trust what you read there. The problem with the internet is you just get all this stuff, and it isn't peer reviewed, or you have no way of easily knowing. And for the idea that we're all going to be able to determine for ourselves which is telling the right stuff, I think is very naive. Maybe AI someday will do all that for us, but then we have to trust AI, right? Whose AI do we trust? So, you know, we don't have that now. But we will, I believe. I think in time we're going to find ways in which to screen information rather than censor it and to develop trust. And with that, I think some of the intensity of the absurdities that we see happening now will calm down. So I think that's more transient, although very painful right now, condition. All right, well, let me get started now on the topic. I just wanted to sort of frame it where I was going and why. I hope if I can make this go. So let me, oops, what did I do? I'm pretty good with this, I thought, but this one's, is it good? No, that's good. I'm embarrassed. You know, maybe you ought to fire me. I've been an academic for almost a half a century. You think I would know? Oh, it worked. Oh, you did it. Okay, that's fine. I don't care how I said it. I had no pride in the ability to use that. Okay, so, you know, how are we able to distort science? And I'm going to break it down to different categories to see, you know, there's different ways we can do it. One, very simply, is coercion. I can go and say, if you don't put in the wrong data, or you don't say the wrong thing, and you don't say something that is not factual, I'll fire you. That's a pretty big penalty. In some cases, they say, we'll put you in jail. Okay? So, simply, you're coerced. You know, someone puts a gun to your head and says, do you believe that the moon is made out of green cheese? Yes, I do. Okay? Pretty prosaic, but factual. What's the second one? I say repeated assertion or repeated denial as a substitute for either theory or data. This is sometimes called the big lie or propaganda, where you just keep saying, you know, gravity is not 9.8 meters per second, the sun moves from west to east, whatever it is, you just keep repeating it and saying it and saying it and saying it, and people come to say, well, I hear it all the time, it must be true. I mean, it's amazing, but that's what happens. That's the propaganda kind, that's the big lie, and we see people attempting to do that, and sometimes it succeeds, particularly in societies that try to block off other sources of alternative. But there's another source of this thing that is different in the sense it's not insidious on purpose. Can we move forward? Yeah, I know. Okay, so I'm going to describe an example from the 2008 crisis. An example of something in which there was a definite statement made by super expert economist, very famous economist, a vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, when asked the question, what were the most important errors or mistakes that caused the great financial crisis? One of them, and it doesn't matter, it's a kind of technical thing, but one of them was they pointed to a change that our SEC, that's like your CRS here, that's the watchdog over what brokers and dealers and security market entities do, and that they made a change which allowed banks and investment banks to take much more leverage, take much more risk. And that was seen as imprudent and contributing to what happened. This change that took place, the so-called net capital rule. And in fact, and I'll show it on the next slide just briefly, the vice chairman of the Fed wrote this as a New York Times editorial in which he said this was one of the most stupid, outrageous mistakes made, okay? And the New York Times picked it up and decided to comment that this is a point, so now the New York Times owned that statement. Now let me tell you what the facts are. Facts are, okay, that first of all, we trace back where did this statement come from. It came from a guy who was a former SEC economist, not somebody highly noted, who made the remark in some meeting he was in some article. He just said that this is what was allowed to happen. He didn't like that happened in 2004. So that's apparently the source that started this. I won't go into all the how it happened, but some of the best known economists in the United States, along with the vice chairman, who's also a very well known economist, came out saying this and repeated it meeting after meeting. What was the result? Everybody knew it had to be true. Why? They had heard it over and over again, and they had heard it from important sources. Apparently nobody went back and checked the source. Nobody went in and factually tried it. Now, actually, someone from the SEC actually did say it didn't do that, but no one wanted to pay attention to that. And it went on anyway, because it was a good story. Even if it wasn't true, it was a good story, right? I mean, it explained something. And so we went on. Now, the fact is, they did not increase the leverage. The second fact is the GAO, that's our government accounting office that's supposed to check things, reports that the leverage of the actual companies was materially lower than it was in 1998. Simply reporting on top of the fact that the SEC said they didn't do it. When you look what they did, they didn't do it. And when you then looked at what the companies that they thought was the reason that they caused problems, that their leverage hadn't gone up, that both empirically and in every way I can think of shows that, as a matter of fact, it didn't happen. So what's the lesson here? Was there some devious reason that these economists want to do that? I don't think so. I don't think they were saying, we know this is false, but we have a profit motive or prestige motive, or we want to get even with it, or we want to do something. I think this is an example of a phenomenon that happens exactly in science quite often. You can find things that are said in science and repeated, there's a long history of it, where when you actually investigate it, it never was done, never happened, or the tests were never made. And so the moral here is, first establish that the phenomenon exists before you try to explain why it exists, blame why it exists, or try to fix it. And the reason I bring this up, and by the way, even if it's repeated often by very important people, don't take it as a fact, particularly if you're a scientist or any professional. That's not good enough, just that you've heard it many times or read it in the New York Times or heard it from reputable people. That's not good enough. That's not a primary source. I mention this one because you'd be aware of it, but two, to show you that sometimes the fiction is not malicious in the sense that somebody did it for a reason like profit or power or some other things. Many times it is, don't mishear me. But I'm just reporting it isn't as simple that that's always what causes these to happen. Although I will mention, I believe to this day, even though it appeared in print, that what I've just told you, that none of those economists that I know have yet gone back and retracted it. But we'll move on from that, or we won't get into it. Okay, so that's one. Now if we can go back. Forward, let me just, by the way, copies of the slides, my slides are available too. I'm not really going to use them all. But I hope that the organizers will make them too. If you have anything in here you want to interest, this just has it. Please go back one more. Do you have it? Yeah. I just don't. The point. Yeah. That I don't know how to use. Oh, okay. Oh, that's all. Okay. Thank you. All right. So that's the second one. Now we move over, I'll just talk about some of these pretty briefly because I want to move on. Deliberately understating and overstating the uncertainty about the predicted consequences. This is not about the forecast. You hear someone say, this is going to happen, or this is most likely to happen. That's the usual top line. But what you have to think about is how reliable or how accurate is that forecast? Yes, it may be the most likely, but what are the range of things that could happen and how likely it is to happen can change your view. Remember my opening remarks about the trip. If you don't know where you're going, you would pack with flexible strategy, you would pack for both cold and hot. If you knew for sure where you're going, you would pack very differently. The error here is, it's not your forecast of what's most likely to happen is biased or wrong, but rather the degree of uncertainty of what can happen versus what you expect to happen is inaccurate, and that can lead to very bad policies because we can think we don't need flexibility. Flexibility is a solution for dealing with uncertainty. And if you don't think you have uncertainty, you do it. Some people will try to keep it low in order to get people to agree. On the other hand, people can go the other way, and I think we heard some examples, where something is actually pretty darn sure. It doesn't have a lot of uncertainty about it, but they attempt to create the illusion that there's a lot of uncertainty about it in an attempt to say, well, we can't change the forecast, but we surely can make people uncomfortable that it's likely to happen. And then the reverse happens. When you could do just one right thing because you know what's right, you then pack and take a strategy, political or otherwise, which is more flexible. Providing flexibility when you don't need it is costly. There's no safe harbor. Okay, so let me move to the next one. Selection bias. Now, selection bias is when we look at the data that we have, and either advertently or inadvertently, we take a subset of the data to draw and make our conclusions. And we select the data in a way which is not random, that gives us a bias. Now, sometimes that happens because people are incompetent. They do things like data mining. They look at all the data and then they keep fitting it and fitting it and fitting it, and then they test the model they get out of that, and surprise, surprise, they get very high statistics, even though, of course, they came from the same data they were tested on. It sounds bizarre, but that actually happens. Okay? Sometimes it happens because people want to, sort of hide some of the data. We'll talk about one of the reasons they might. Okay? And then sometimes it's just done because people have cognitive behavioral dysfunctions. One example is the following. Suppose you asked me to do something like manage some money for you. Just, you gave me some money to manage for you. And then I come back to you in a year and I say, I lost a lot of money for you. Boy, well, not only are you going to be unhappy, but you're probably going to say, let's do a lot of forensic analysis. Why did he lose all that money? We really need to get to the bottom of this. And that's true whether you're a person or an institution. On the other hand, what if you gave me your money, and at the end of the year, I made you a boatload of money, lots of money, much more than you anticipated? I think you'll find that very few institutions and even fewer individuals implement a study of why I made you so much money. You just say, hey, that was great. You have an asymmetry, whereas if you analyze it rationally, you recognize you have an expectation, you had a distribution. You had a realization that was, let's say, unusual, maybe very unusual, for what you thought the distribution is. It doesn't matter whether it was favorable or unfavorable, the outcome. That could be luck. Okay? What's important is that you got a signal that what you thought was the distribution that had been offered by me to you, that you agreed that I would do for you, may have been violated, and you need to find out. But you definitely get asymmetrically. So that creates a very definite bias in the behavior of how things go. The other thing we do is we sometimes just look at data until we see what the result we thought we should expect to find, and we stop there. We don't keep running more tests. And all of this kind of selection bias can cause lots of problems. Now let me talk about a deliberate one, one that we institutionalize actually in courts of law, and that is the difference is that if you are an advocate, that's a different role than if you're a sort of unbiased, think of the prototypical scientist. You're going to call it as it's seen, whatever the facts are, let the facts be what they are, with no particular edge as to which way it goes. Well, what are advocates? Their role, and we have them in courts, people defend people, we have them in people who believe in something and they wanted to do it, they become advocates. They are not required to give a balanced argument. They're taking a role of using all the information they can to make the case for what their advocacy is. They don't have to be balanced. So, for example, in court cases, they bring in experts. The experts testify. Guess what? The experts disagree. Well, I don't think generally the experts are biased in the sense that they purposely change their testimony or change the way they did things because they were paid money to do it. That does happen. But they don't need that. I just have to look for an expert whose beliefs, real beliefs, the ones that if you took a lie detector test, they said were their beliefs. I just have to see the who has a point of view that supports my position. So I look around for an expert whose views fit what I want to argue in court. I get the expert. So the bias is not in the expert, it's in the selection of the expert. And that's, again, viewed and understood as an advocacy role, but it makes it a difference between that of what we'd like to think in science is truth as we hear it, that the role is to provide truth. It isn't the role in many situations. And I bring this up because advocacy is a legitimate activity, but when you mix it with people who are also supposed to be scientists, meaning they're both talented, but they're obligated or attempting or want to give the truth, however it comes, as completely as they can. Those are conflicting. I may believe that I want something to happen because I think it's right or I think it's a good thing as a person. What do I do if I do the scientific work and the scientific work doesn't support it, supports something else? Well, as a scientist, you want me to say, here's the way it is, and that's it. But if I'm the advocate, I now have conflict. And even if I'm not really someone who would be conflicted, I always tell the truth. Just being an advocate creates the appearance of a conflict. And the appearance of the conflict can compromise your influence and believability as a scientist. And so one of the things about this I would point out is that there's a bit of a challenge between being an advocate, which there's nothing wrong with it, and being a scientist. Anyway, let me move on from that. Next one, taking facts out of context. Well, I have an example from my home institution, MIT. Mr. Trump, on the day he announced that he was getting out of the Paris Accord, he cited an MIT study that said something like the biggest effect in 30 years, don't quote me exactly the number, it was like 0.2 of a degree Celsius difference. That's tiny. And he cited an MIT 2016 study. It turned out that number, taken completely out of context, came up from a 2014 study of a different sort. But, so different study, different situation. So that's an example of stating what was believed to be a fact by scientists at MIT, but taking it out of context and putting it back in, sort of like your genes in a negative way, as a way of distorting the reality and how you can do it. And it was done. Another one, in my world, I had something to do with, my prize was in developing ways of managing risk and so forth using derivatives. And there's a famous quote that's used over and over again by a variety of people, from Warren Buffett, Mr. Investor, who said, derivatives are weapons of mass financial destruction. That's pretty tough statement. Now, why I won't spend the time to tell you the story, although the story is in public, but I would point out the following. I think, I not actually know Mr. Buffett, but I think he's a very honorable person, and I think he's certainly not a hypocrite. Berkshire Hathaway uses derivatives all over the place. In fact, during the crisis, they sold $15 billion worth of them to various firms. Do you really think Warren Buffett would be selling weapons of mass financial destruction? I'm just letting you think about that. I can tell you it came out of context. It came out of reporting of a very special case that had nothing at all to do with the derivatives markets. But in any case, example, out of context. So that's another way to get distortion. Now, framing, the next one I wanted to show, oops, and now I've learned how to do this, is framing as a economic or scientific positive statement, like gravity is 9.8 meters per second. Framing something that way when it's actually a preference, or if you like, a normative preference statement. Now I can explain from my field an example of that that's very common. You don't have to know the abscissa here in the ordinate. What we have here is, on this axis we have risk, doesn't matter how it's measured, and on this axis you have reward, expected return. That's good, that's bad, and life is about trading off the two. You can't get one without the other. Now what I can do as a professional, call it a scientist, call it a professional, someone who's skilled, is I can take all the things you might do, which is measured by this mass over here. This mass. That's a lot of choices. It's very dense. And I can look at all the things you could do, and I can derive, as a scientific, from theory, empirical work, that the only ones that are relevant for you to consider are the blue border. Because you can see that all the points interior to that either have more risk for the same benefit or less benefit for the same risk. So if you go horizontally or vertically, you can see that. So if I can create that frontier, I can make life a lot simpler for the world. That's my contribution. Of all the things you could do, the only things you really have to consider are the blue line, the blue curve. That in itself doesn't involve any normative judgment. It's simply, like I did the analysis, this is the way things work, here's what's available to you. But what we have to do as society, if we're making this choice as society, is which point on that curve do we select for society or for ourselves or for our whomever we're deciding? You could pick the point that's marked on the lower part that has lower risk and lower return, or pick the point on the higher part. You see, those are two choices. Any point on that curve is a choice. Notice no point on that curve dominates the other, so I can say nobody would want that. Now, if I say, my preference, me as a person, is I like a lot of risk because we get a lot of expected return, and I say we ought to do that top point, B, for society, that's a preference of mine. I'm particularly no more, you shouldn't give me any more weight on my vote than anybody else. Because the thing I'm special about for me in this was creating the choice set. That I did contribute. But which point we check is really my preference against others. And in a society or any group, we have to weigh the preferences of everyone and find some way in which we come up with a conclusion. But I shouldn't be given more weight that we should do B versus A than anyone else. But I could make the statement that I think B should be done, and people would say, oh, well, he's an expert in this area, therefore he's essentially telling us economics says that we should do it this way. And it isn't economics, it's preference. And if you look at a lot of statements that are made, particularly with respect to policies, choices, they're choices. All of us, I think, are entitled to give our view on what the choice we would like to have. That I'm not taking away. But I do think we have to be very careful that we distinguish between people who are expressing preferences and people who are expressing positive scientific statements. So that one I just wanted to show. And now, okay, I'll get it right eventually. There we go. Whoops. I guess I'm what I wanted to go through now is the information system and show a little more detail, and given the time, I'll just touch on it. I've talked about how you can have it happen, but where does this happen? It always involves somewhere in our information supply system. We start with data, then we organize the data in some fashion. We then use the data organized in a model. From the model, we interpret what we get, and then from the interpretation, we recommend actions. When we recommend those actions, we do it, yes. Okay, this is the whole system. So we have data organizer, the model, then you have output from the model, interpretation, action, you have constraints, and then you have the intended consequences and things that you didn't anticipate. I just want to run through the various points here where these can happen. First, the data. What can happen with the data? What can happen with the data is that you mess it up. In the case of the one most recently, I'm not picking our president, but it's fresh data off the press. He just, the funding for a NSA study, a National Academy study for health in coal mining up in the mountains and so forth was supposed to be done. Everybody wanted to do it. It got canceled. It's not going to be done. If it's not done, what will happen? There won't be the data on the health. We won't have the data. If we don't have the data, that's one way to mess around with the data. You just don't allow it to be created. Another way of the data you use, and lo and behold, the banks were okay. At least they were being closed down. Now, it's understandable you may not want it. It may even be believed that the people there making that decision did that in the interest that they really thought assets were artificially low. The way they should have done it, okay, is they should have done it by lowering the capital requirements. In other words, banks have capital requirements to protect them. If you really thought the assets were worth more than their price, don't mismeasure the data, don't change the measurement, change the rule. You say, in our judgment, instead of 8%, you only need 3%, because we think these assets are worth a lot more, and we, as the ruling body here, make that judgment. That's okay with me. They may be wrong, but at least they're taking the responsibility and it's transparent that they've made that decision. What they did instead was to mess with the measurement system, and that's what's always done. So they changed the measurement of prices, just like Argentina, thinking that if we move the data, everything will be fine, or at least it'll take care of the case. What's the casualty from that? The casualty from that every time is that when you take the information system and you distort the data, it's flying. You don't have anything. People weren't foolish. They know those weren't real prices. They know the inflation in Argentina was much higher than was being reported. It's naive, to say the least, that by reporting numbers that don't make sense, that people are going to believe them. They don't. But what's bad is they don't know what they are. So they know they're bad, they know they're a lot lower, but they don't have any clue how much lower because you've shut off their data. And this happens over and over again, where in the name of stability, and believe me, it happens in every country, including this one, where the reaction is, for stability purposes, we're going to change the data. And every time that happens, it has the unintended consequence of making people more scared because they know the numbers there aren't real, but they have no clue what the real numbers are. Better to show them the low prices so they know what the numbers are. And then if you want to give forbearance for stability reasons, you want to step up, lower the capital requirements, or even insert capital into the banks if you have to. But don't play with the measurement system. And I don't know how much in the other parts of science this happens, but in this area, it happens everywhere all the time. And it's a very damaging thing, because in times of stress, you need more information. Okay, well, let me run a little further. The because of time, I see I've run way over. Let me just say, the system in pensions, I'm going to say about that in the United States. Here's what happens. We have a pension system, our public pension system, not our Social Security, not our corporations, but this is for the states and local governments, and those of you, the state of California, the city of New York. Public pensions for the workers. Those are funded by law. They're supposed to be funded. There are a set of rules of how much they have to be funded, and they have to have contributions from the cities and states funded. That's the law. And the funding is supposed to provide the security to pay these things. Now, they didn't fund them. Why? Because it was very expensive to fund them, and then they would have to cut down on things they wanted to do now, like teachers and so forth. So you had this problem that the rules said you have to fund them, you don't want to violate the law, and the president was certainly not going to say double the contributions so that you bankrupt cities and states. That's not going to happen. So what do? You've got the law telling you they have to fund. They're way underfunded if you value them. The president understandably says there's no way I'm going to let you enforce that. So what do? Break the law? The answer is what you do is you play with the accounting. You change the rules by which you calculate the value. And that's what they did. They created a totally crazy rule. No economist, no financier, no practitioner would ever justify this rule. It says, calculate your liabilities to workers by discounting their future benefits at the expected return on your assets in your fund, which means the more risk you take in your fund, the lower are your liabilities. So it has the worst effect. Not only does it mismeasure what's owed, it doesn't only mean that you don't make contributions, but on top of that, what it does is it forces them to go into risky investments by the simple rule. So as fast pass to the thing, this is an example of the distortion that happens when forced to do it because it was a constraint that there's no other choice. Okay? So similar things happen with our government that guarantees all kinds of things. We neither budget for that nor do we expense for that. These guarantees are insurance policies. We would never let an insurance company have no reserves, say because they might not pay out your life insurance, they don't have a liability. But that's what we do with governments, mostly. So let me kind of fast forward here, and I apologize for not having gone at least there. As I pointed out here, the constraints are sometimes the reasons we distort the system. And what I wanted you to see here is, yes, there are bad players. There are people who do what they do that distort science, coercion, whatever. They do it because they're coerced. Someone puts a gun. They do it because they have no choice. I'm head of pensions. President won't let me increase contributions, force contributions to go up. The law tells me I have to. So I changed the accounting system. The problem is it doesn't fix it. And if I could give you this, for climate, in 2011, the public pension system of the United States was underwater, meaning the value of what they had promised versus what they had in assets, by $4 trillion. That's not a projection. That's if you shut the system down tomorrow. No future. $4 trillion, even for a rich country in the United States, is huge. But the big problem is it doesn't stop being that. Because it's misfunded, it just keeps growing. Politically, we've been unwilling to even talk about it. Neither side of the aisle in the United States will talk about it. So at least they're talking about climate control. No one wants to talk about the pension system. And as a result, we have a big problem. Could that problem be solved? Yes. We know technically how to do it. We can fix the system and build something that's sustainable. But we can't do that until we admit we have a problem. No politician will do that on either side of the aisle. Hasn't, not 2008, 2012, 2016. All the fire and fury between them never mentioned this. This is because it's too big. and it's very, very sensitive. So, if nothing else, I hope for all of those who are looking at these issues, the issues that are raised, playing with the numbers, bringing in fiction, playing with the measurement system. These are really big, damaging things. And once you get out of hand with them, as with the pension system, it's very hard to get anyone to try to step up and say, quote, be brave. Because I promise you, if you were the politician that did that, if you could do it, or the dictator, everyone will hate you. No one will say, good job. Everyone will hate you. And that's a dynamic that's very difficult to overcome. We will, it's just that we may have to go through a crisis to do it. It's sad, but sometimes the only way you get change is when it blows up in your face. I hope we don't have that with climate, but look at what we've done with our pension system, and it's true around the world. There are other reasons, internal motivations, wealth, power, altruism, external motivations, the incentives and roles. Economists always talk about incentives. If I created an economic incentive for you to do something, you're going to probably do it. If I'm the chief compensation officer of a company, there is no such guy. If there were, I'm really going to run the company. If I decide everybody's compensation, I'm really going to control how that company runs. External, again, depends on incentives. We have, of course, the distortion of the names. Those are private gain and so forth. I've mentioned the advocate versus science rule. People are advocates. They feel for the greater good, the means justify the ends. So they say, in the name of what's good for society, I may not report everything because people will get confused or they may misuse it. Therefore, I won't tell them about it. So there can be good people who believe they're doing good things, who have the same kind of effects, in fact, destructive effects. So it isn't always just the knaves. It isn't always something that we can cure simply by changing the incentives in some way or another. In some cases, we find that people are, again, doing, this way. Now, I've already showed you examples of behavioral cognitive dysfunctions. Those are the fools. So we have fools and knaves. We have fools and knaves in the financial system. We have fools and knaves who are making decisions about what we do in our development, whether it's GMO or climate and so forth. Can we all vote? We don't want any fools and knaves. We'll always have them, but I think we can all agree on that. My point here is getting rid of them is not good enough. We will still have problems that occur. Problems occur for good-natured people, people who have good motivations, but don't understand the total feedback implications of what they advocate and are not taking into account those externalities, and as a result, we get outcomes that are different. And finally, on the unintended consequences of these social actions, I would just mention that there are examples in our newest version of the pension system in the US where, because we're measuring what's risk wrong, we've codified it in our regulations. We now are putting older people in these systems. As they get older, we're supposed to put them at less risk. We're actually putting them at more risk. I know that sounds bizarre, because we're measuring risk wrong. The way we're told to measure it by statute makes it look like we're going to less risk. When you measure it by the science of what it is, we're actually putting older people in more risk. What does that mean? And once again, if you measure wrong, you can't manage it. If you measure risk wrong, if you measure illness wrong, you can't possibly manage it, right? This pension thing has been around for 30-odd years. We're now really beginning to see the bills are starting to come in. I hope that we can find a better way to deal with this. I've already run over, so I will, I better just, I guess I should just stop on that because I've taken some of my colleagues' time, and just say distortions, screening case, the importance of not constraining information in markets. not messing with the measurement system, building trust and understanding, avoiding conflicts, all sound like apple pie, but we need to do those if we want to see. As scientists, frankly, the solution is not to tell us the public got to get educated about science. I'm sorry. I don't think that's the answer. I think we as scientists have to do what every other kind of activity in businesses do. If we want people to learn and understand, we have to market ourselves. Marketing and education. You can have good, intelligent, useful marketing. You can have crummy marketing. And you can have great, intelligent education and good education. I believe for the population to prepare them and help them to keep the kinds of fictions that are going on here, we need to go on the offensive, but on the offensive where we find a language, find a means to communicate, trust, communicate the very things that seem so clear to us when we hear Rich or Steve talk about these issues. How can anybody disagree? The answers are, one is, I've given you some. They're not all because people are stupid or naive or bad, but they are perhaps the best way we can do something is to go on the offensive. Many people here are professors and teachers. Many people here are building online training systems. Again, education and marketing for this purpose are really the same activity, and we need to find a way to communicate. I know I'm taking up your time, but I feel very passionately we have the responsibility. We cannot leave it on them to get the societies educated, to get them to understand our language. We have to get them to understand why what we have to say they should want it to do. Thank you.